Welcome back to another episode of Beyond the Stable. I'm your host, Megan Scott, and today I'm joined by Helen West. Helen is a course designer and an event organiser who do national and international competitions across multiple disciplines. I'm so excited for today's episode because we haven't actually had a course designer on the podcast yet, so I already know it's going to be so insightful. For my audio listeners who can't actually see, we are currently at Bicton Arena ahead of Bicton International Horse Trials in a couple of weeks, which I'm actually going to be attending, and I can't wait. I'm so excited. I'm going to leave all the ticket information and everything down below if you guys want to come along as well. It's going to be a really great couple of days, and I just can't wait, like I said. So, yeah, let's get into it. Thank you, firstly, for joining me.
No, thank you for having me.
I want to start off how I do with all my guests. Obviously, we'll get into the course design and everything, but I'd like to get a little bit of context on you to begin with. So if you could tell me how you got into horses.
Sure. Gosh, it was a long time ago. So I neither of my parents were massively horsey. In fact, my dad has never sat on a horse in his life, even to this day. My mum had been horsey, but like years and years before she had me. And my parents both met actually playing tennis. They were both into their tennis, so quite sporty, but obviously completely different. And I was supposed to play tennis. Went off for lots of tennis lessons when I was little, and yeah, I disappointed the parents on that front because I wasn't remotely interested in tennis. All I ever wanted to do was ride. So I guess when I was about 6, my mum sort of said, "Oh, let's humour her. Let her go for some riding lessons. It'll be a passing phase. She'll fall off, and that'll be that." And sadly for my parents, that wasn't that. I just loved it. I've always been sort of horse mad. Always wanted to event. When I was younger, in those days, those good old days, you had to be a member of the BHS, the British Horse Society, and you couldn't actually event until you were 16. So I very much sort of grew up through the pony club ranks, and was a very active member of the pony club, did my H test, my A test, and actually won the pony club national championships, crikey, in 1999. And actually with that horse then went on to be on the British Young Rider team, and he won gold at the European Championships. So it's interesting. I look back and I think I had a really good, strong pathway into the sport. And I'm very grateful to the Pony Club for a lot of that. So I evented up to 5-star level until relatively recently. And I still do compete. I've got a young horse at the moment actually that I'm producing to event, and I've done quite a bit of the last sort of more recent years. I've actually show jumped to a reasonably good level, so I still keep my finger in. And I'm very lucky to have been able to do something that I absolutely love, and I had a very loyal bunch of owners who really supported me. I was always the horses I had, I produced from scratch. My first junior European horse came off the racetrack. And to be honest, all of the horses that I've had sort of success with were all sort of produced from 4 or 5-year-olds. And I guess that's probably why I still sort of enjoy producing the young horses now. It's always given me a real sort of sense of achievement and satisfaction to bring them on. So I still like to do a little bit of that as well.
Yeah, no, amazing. Really nice background. Obviously, you've been 5-star. Do you want to speak me what it was like working your way up the ranks and getting to that top level?
Yeah. Hard. And especially I look back and I sort of think I was very fortunate in, although with the best will in the world, my parents, I don't come from money. It was very much sort of self-made, and I was quite academic at school. Parents wanted me to go to uni and have a proper career. All I wanted to do was, the horses and event. So the deal I did with my mum was that I did my A-levels, came out with good A-levels, so I would always have something to fall back on. So from a very young age, I guess, I was probably... even when I was doing my GCSEs, I had horses in for owners that I was sort of producing. And after I had sort of finished school, it was just a kind of extension of that. So I just sort of developed that a little bit further and, had a yard full of horses. At the time, I would have taken pretty much anything in. I did breakers, bought horses on to sell for owners. I had some very, supportive owners that, we sort of kept the horses up through the ranks as much as we could. And it was, much as it was hugely enjoyable, and, I was very lucky to be doing something that I'm so passionate about. It was hard, and it was hard to be able to, compete with the best one in the world. Sort of my peers who potentially had more financial support. And I would produce some horses which, were very talented and would get sold for a lot of money. And, that was like, oh gosh, now I'm back to square one again. And here we go again, sort of, another bunch of young horses. But it's a tough gig. And I think, for sort of like the young riders, you're so desperate to be seen out there and at a good level. You tend to want to work your way up and take rides on horses that, probably some of the good riders have sort of respectfully turned down. And it's difficult to, to be strong at that stage and say, no, actually, do you know what? That horse isn't good enough. I don't want to ride that. You feel like you need to say yes to everything, and you need to keep the owners happy, to keep the horses in the yard, to build that string. And I look back now and I think, crikey, some of the horses I rode at some of the levels I did, knowing what I know now, and especially with my course design hat on, I would be saying to a younger version of myself, Helen, what are you doing? No, it's not a good enough jumper. It shouldn't be going at that level. Don't cave into the pressure. But I had, I bought my first house when I was 20, 21. So I had a mortgage from quite a young age, and I had those responsibilities, and I needed to know that I had enough money coming in each month. So, I certainly rode some horses that I probably should have turned around and said, no, thank you.
Yeah.
But I felt like I had to, because otherwise, the owners would find somebody else to ride them. And that's hard, that is hard. And that's one of the things, with the sport that, certainly for the younger generation now, I would sit here and say, no, be very, very strong in what you are happy riding and have belief in. And if you're not confident in that horse's ability, don't go out the start box that day. And I think that's quite hard. I think that's quite hard for, especially for the young generation.
Let's jump into the course design then. How did you get into that career?
So in 2013, I started working for Clinton Devon Estates. I took a proper job, as my mum would say. And it was the first sort of like, obviously, proper job, other than obviously being self-employed and doing the horses. And I had been coming to Bicton sort of, all my life, growing up in the southwest, eventing in this region. So I knew, the venue, but I had no idea what I was kind of taking on. And I kind of look back and I think, crikey, the interview for actually working for the estate was sort of like getting into MI5. I had 3 interviews. Then I had to do a 10-minute presentation on a sort of 5-year business plan for the arena. And then I had to have psychometric testing. So by the time I got the job, I was like, oh my God, what have I signed up for? But one of the things when I first sort of started the job, it was my kind of remit to try and make it profitable. So I started looking at where the costs and how we could increase the income. And one of the big costs was the cross-country build and design, because at that stage, the estate was sort of having, an established sort of team of builders to come in for every single event, whether it was pony club, hunter trial, riding club, one-day event, as well as they were just running one BE affiliated competition at that time. And it was expensive, and so one of the things I thought was, well, hang on a minute, surely I could put the fences out there, I've sort of evented to 5-star levels, surely I would be able to have an eye to be able to do that. So I got into it to save the estate money. And the irony of it is I sort of very quickly started to get the bug for it, and actually fairly quickly sort of worked my way up through through the BE sort of ranks with the designing, and went to my first FEI seminar at Le Lion d'Angers in France, and got onto the FEI ladder, so I could sort of design at 2 and 3 star level internationally, and just really got hooked on it, and actually found that I got that same adrenaline rush that I would get when I was riding cross country with the design side of things. So it kind of almost, yeah, hooked me in that respect as well. And this, I was very lucky. I was very lucky that I had Bicton as a platform, because it's very hard to get into design, because unless you've got a course that you can actually start designing, it's really, really tricky to get into. So I was very fortunate that I had that sort of opportunity, and also that the estate were very supportive, because although I was working for them managing Bicton, they let me go off and do, these, like when I went to France, these seminars, and they were very supportive of me sort of building up my course design career. So I'm always sort of very grateful to them for facilitating that. So that's how I got into it, though. It was kind of, yeah, economy and trying to save the estate some money.
Can you give us a little back look into kind of what the process is for designing a course?
Sure. So it very much depends on the site, and it very much depends on your knowledge of the site. So like now with, obviously with Bicton, I feel like I kind of know every lump and bump and, little bit of terrain out there. If you were going into like a new site, you'd 100% want to go and, physically be there on the ground, walking and getting a feel for it. The terrain plays a massive part. And whereas like with a show jumping course design, you could sort of sit behind a computer or your iPad, and actually once you've got the dimensions of the arena that you're designing in, you could design it on paper, without actually physically being there. Cross country is very, very different, and it is all about the sort of terrain and the topography that otherwise, you would sit down and sort of just with a piece of paper and, scribble it out. So the first thing would be to get a feel for it. Where it can be really useful now with some of the technology we've got, we have the cross country app, which is absolutely brilliant. And you can then plot your track on your phone or your iPad. And in terms of getting the right distance, that's where it's really useful at an early stage, because there's certain parameters. So for each level, there's a certain number of cross country efforts, so a certain number of fences that is dictated. That's what the course has to be, and there's a distance that it has to be. So actually playing around with it, with the app, saves you huge amounts of time, because you can make sure you nail your distance before you start. So once I've walked a site, got a feel for it, I've sorted out my distance and the route and where it's going, then is the time to sit down and start thinking, right, what fences do I want and where do I want those? And again, that sort of, working with the venue and what sort of jump inventory they have. So, the sport's moved very much in the direction of portable cross-country fences now, whereas in the old days, you'd build a permanent fence, like in a hedge line, and that would stay there then. But what tended to happen was that, that event ran once a year and it was always the same route. Now we have venues that run, 3, sometimes 4 times a year, and we have to mix up the route. Otherwise, it's really dull for riders, because every time they come, they're jumping the same cross-country course. So portable fences has enabled that. So once I have an understanding of the inventory of fences and what that venue has got, then I'll sit down and I'll always have an idea in my head what profile of fence I want at each juncture and where I'm placing the fences. But then I'll try and marry up what fences they've got with what I'm looking for. And then I'll come up with my actual fence 1 is this, fence 2 is this, fence 4 is, a double of cottages, or whatever that looks like. And then, you can have a really good idea on paper what you're going to have. But the fun starts when you actually arrive on site to place the fences, because sometimes what you've got in your mind's eye and then what you have on the ground when you're actually placing the fences is very different. So I can think to myself, right, I'm going to have 2 offset skinny brushes in X spot, and then go to place it and think, crikey, no, that's just not going to work. So then you kind of have to change it a little bit, and it evolves as you go along. So it's a kind of continuous process. And then by the time you get to the finished product and actually it's flagged, dressed, and you're happy with it and it's ready to go, it's probably gone through several slightly different iterations in the process. It's really sort of telling that story and building up that picture. But it's it's, as you can tell, it's something that I very much enjoy.
Do you have a favourite part of your job?
Crikey. My favourite part of the job is probably afterwards when I can sit, take a deep breath and pour myself a glass of wine and go, oh, I'm really happy with how the track rode. No, I'm joking. My favourite part is placing the fences because it just, yeah, whilst it can also be challenging and frustrating because it doesn't always work how you think it's going to, I also, it presents opportunities, and I love the way the sort of story evolves as you're out there physically doing it, because you know, you suddenly see a piece of ground and think, oh, actually, if I move it 5 yards to the right, that's really going to make a big difference. And I love that sort of tweaking and playing with it.
Yeah. When you're designing a course like Bicton International Horse Trials, for example, what is priorities for you during that process?
um I guess for me, and I mean, I would say for all designers, the flow of the course. You always want your tracks to have good flow, and you want, you know, I put myself back on a horse and put myself in the rider's eyes and how it will feel and how it will feel to ride, and I think that's really, really important. You know, you want right, you want combinations to come back having had a positive experience, and for the track to have flowed and them not have had to pull left, pull right too much. And you know, you want it to produce a nice feeling and a nice picture. And I always think, you know, we have to be true and fair to the horse. You know, the questions we ask have to be clear to the horse. I'm very anti anything trappy or sneaky or trying to catch, you know, catch them out. That's not what it's about. You know, as riders, we'll cock up all the time. Like, we're human, we do that. But it has to then still be fair and obvious to the horse for them to be able to understand the question.
Mm. Can we have a little chat about weather conditions, especially with cross country, and how that impacts your role?
Yeah, you can have the best course in the world designed, and then the weather can completely kibosh that, because it's like, oh, crikey, suddenly they're jumping out of another 6 inches. Yeah, so you always have plan A. I think number one, actually, it does depend hugely on the venue and on the type of ground they've got and the soil they've got.
Yeah.
I'm lucky here at Bicton. We're on sort of old sandy soil, sort of, and it drains incredibly well. So it never gets deep or bottomless here. And we can take an awful lot of rain, and it always is safe ground. So I'm in a fortunate position, you know, and like, we run our last horse trials here the last weekend of October. You know, there probably aren't many venues in England that could do that, but we do have the ground that will take that.
Mhm.
But certainly when I'm designing at other venues, it's something I really do factor in more, because, you know, the good old British weather is the one thing you can never rely on. And actually, you know, if it does get very wet, it can get very cut up quickly, and it can very quickly change the questions that you're asking quite dramatically. And something that, you know, you might have thought was a, I don't know, 6 out of 10 in terms of difficulty suddenly becomes an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And it's like, whoa, hang on a minute. I didn't intend to be asking that much of a question at this point in the course. So I think you always build in a little bit of contingency, in the back of your head when you're putting out the tracks. Um, and you know, you're always looking ahead. You're looking at the forecast. You're looking at, you know, what's happened previously, how the ground's ridden. But I think you always have a sort of plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And it might be that, you know, something you've intended to be an ABC combination, actually on the day you end up making an AB, because that's enough, because you're contending with the ground and actually deteriorating footing. So you don't want to have a C element, because actually that makes the question too difficult. And it's also a conversation with your builders, and in terms of, you know, what you've got in place for the ground. So having enough stone dust, you know, and understanding what you need to do to keep the ground good. And that's where communication is really, really key with those that have knowledge of the site.
Mhm.
Because, you know, it might be that they say, oh, actually avoid that bit of ground over there, because if it does get wet, that bit cuts up really badly. And it might be a really, really great bit of terrain that you really want to use, but you need to listen to those people that understand and have knowledge of the site. to kind of protect yourself from those situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, yeah, communication, having some flexibility, plan A, B, and C, and being organized and having a plan.
Yeah. You kind of touched on it a little bit there, but I would like to speak about how you work with the other people in the team, so the builder, the officials, the rider.
Yeah.
What's that like?
All about communication. And I think, having been a rider, I think it's really interesting. I think we're all in this sport together, and there should never be a them and us. We are all in it together. We all want the sport to be a success. We all want riders to be safe. We want them to have a good ride. As a designer, you want to ask, the questions that are appropriate to that level, but it's all about dialogue and it's all about talking to each other. So I would urge, any riders, as officials, we are approachable. If you've got any issues or any queries or any concerns, always come and talk to us, because that is really, really important. And I always value, and I guess because I probably still ride as well, I want to know what the riders think. I want to know how it felt. So, when the first few riders get back from riding, one of my tracks, I will always sort of pop over and say, how was it? What did you think? How did this ride? And get the feedback. And equally, from with the officials, the whether it's national, so your technical advisor, or FEI as a technical delegate, they're there to help make your track as good as it possibly can be. And I think that sort of two-way interaction is really important. And some TDs perhaps bring more to the table because they have more of a design background, so you can actually sort of have a bit of, they can check and challenge you a little bit, and actually, not to say, oh, I don't think you should do that, or the question you're asking is wrong, but to just get you thinking about what you actually are asking, and could you do something that would make it better. So I think, it's all about the communication and the dialogue and working together as a team, because we all want the same outcome, and we all need to be singing off the same hymn sheet.
I'd like to get your thoughts on trends, whether it be in show jumping or in cross country with fences, maybe upcoming trends or past trends, just your thoughts kind of on that topic as a whole.
Yeah, sure. So, there's no doubt about it. We do go through trends. We see that, with whatever the discipline is. Cross country wise, I think, we've moved much more towards sort of technicality and technical difficulty, and the jumpable widths becoming narrower and angles greater, and it's moved away from the sort of big old fashioned like rider frighteners. We've got very different types of horses in the sport now, and arguably we train the horses slightly differently. One of the challenges I think our sport has is making it understandable and easier for the public to know what on earth's going on. Like watching badminton this last weekend was absolutely brilliant. I thought it was a really, really good day for the sport. The picture was good. What was frustrating was the flag issues. So at the moment, obviously, right horse knocks a flag with its shoulder, rider knocks a flag with their stirrup. The differences and the kind of the 15 penalties, it is a really contentious issue, and it is sort of preventing the sport from being instantly understandable for Joe Blogg's public. Because I was sitting there watching badminton, and 1 minute it was like, oh, we've got so and so in the lead. Then it was, oh, actually no, they're not in the lead now because they've been given 15. Then it was, oh no, they're reviewing the footage, and then in an hour and a half's time it was, oh no, now they're back in the lead. Like, that is just too confusing. To sell the sport, it needs to be instant. It needs to be, it's either 15 or it's not. That's one of the things with show jumping. You get an instant result and anyone can watch and understand it. So, you could sit there for an hour and a half and watch a really top level class, and basically you'd explain to somebody the fastest one wins and they have to leave all, or not knock any show jumps down. and it's easy to get your head around. But with cross country, it's like, okay, right, well, if they hit a frangible fence, actually they get 11, and if a flag goes down, it may or may not be 15, and if they go behind the back of a fence, that might be 20. It needs to be more straightforward. So in terms of trends, one of the certainly one of the proposals that was put forward following Paris, the Olympics, was that if you knock a flag down, you get penalties. Just black and white. So, watching it, you would understand if somebody pushes a flag out, they get, say, 4 penalties. That was very, very strongly sort of pushed back against and contested by the riders. Just in terms of the sort of spirit of the sport, and actually horses making an effort to jump the fence and answer the question. And we saw in Paris with Ros Canter with the flag issue there, actually there can be a very sort of, there's very distinct differences between, for example, tapping the flag with your stirrup and it falling down, and a horse hardly jumping or hardly making any effort to jump the fence and wearing the flag and the flag falling down. So, it's kind of like, hang on a minute, guys, that's not fair. It's not in the spirit of the sport. So that proposal was rejected. And I think it's sort of, after badminton, I think, there'll be more conversations on that, and perhaps what technology's out there, and perhaps AI, and how we could get, to the point where we have a much more instant decision on a flag call. But in terms of trends, certainly when we were looking at it being penalties for the flag down, we were looking at, as a designer, you're asking at the higher levels, certainly, you're asking, riders to take on the angle. So on the front rail of a corner, for example, the question really is the angle on the front rail that they have to accept. The question isn't the top spread. We know that these horses, are jumping 1.80 m, 2 m top spread. They're hugely scopy. That's one of the exciting parts of the sport. But actually, what's not fair is to expect them to take on the angle and then have colossal top spread on a corner. So I felt like the direction we were moving in was that potentially the top spread on a corner would be becoming a bit narrower, because really the question they're answering is the front rail. And although obviously the flag rule hasn't been accepted, I still think that's the direction that we're going in. I think it's very much accepting the angle, but then not pushing the boundaries with the top spread that we're expecting them to have to reach for. And I think one of the other things we have to be careful of is testing the best. It has to be fair for the average horse. So actually, when you're on anything less than, say, 4 strides, if you're on 1, 2 or 3, I think we have to be very careful about the amount of top spread on the second element, because if a horse doesn't get there are no options. A rider can't, when you're on 5, 6 strides, for example, or even 4 strides to a certain degree, there's wiggle room. So the riders can, compress the stride, or they can push the stride forward, or they can very slightly put a bit of a kink in to give themselves more room. If it's 3 strides or less, you can't. You are tied onto it. So then if a horse doesn't get there, we've got to be careful about the amount of top spread on the second element, so we're not getting into ugly pictures and slightly punishing the horse. And I think that actually in show jumping recently, we've seen, like, certainly with Harry Charles, there was he had a very nasty fall when he was over, I think it was in the States, and that was with a vertical to an oxa, so on a 2 stride distance in show jumping. And that's something that we don't do at the lower levels. It's it's an absolute no. They do it at the higher levels, and I think it's perfectly acceptable to do it at the higher levels, as long as there is enough distance in that combination, and you don't just make that distance too squeaky and come too short with it. Because these horses now are so careful, and so that explosive power. The danger is that if they jump the first big, they will pick up on 1 stride, not put the second in, and then jump into the back rail of the oxa coming out. So I don't think it's that we shouldn't ever see that in the sport. I think it's that we have to see it at the right place on a track. So perhaps on a turn back, so they're not coming down a long straight with a gaining stride. They need to be coming on a slightly quieter distance. And it is, at the top level of the sport, and you're not expecting, more amateur combinations to take on that sort of challenge. So yeah, but I mean, as designers, we're always, we always want to do the right thing, and you always want, like I said, to be fair to the horse. At the higher level, it's then that margin of testing the best, and that margin is so narrow. It's such a delicate balance. So yeah, we're always striving to try and do the right thing.
Yeah. This episode is brought to you by Atlantic Harmony Equestrian, where clothes are more than just what you wear, they're how you express yourself. At Atlantic Harmony, we're not just another logo. We're building a community of equestrians who believe in connection, support, and making a difference. Our high-quality, stylish apparel is designed for riders who value both function and fashion, while supporting sustainable practices. Join a brand with a purpose. Visit atlanticharmonyequestrian.co.uk and be part of a community where style meets empowerment. Atlantic Harmony, where riders support riders. Looking into the future of the sport then, is there anything that you would like to see change, or any predictions and things that you think will change?
Oh, crikey. So, I think certainly with weather patterns, climate change, with our sport, cross country, obviously being on grass, we've talked about the weather and how it being the one thing that you can't control. I think, we'll definitely see more, sort of like the plan A, plan B, plan C. So what the track you might walk on, Wednesday when you get to a 3-day event might not be the track that you ride on Saturday, because, if an awful lot of rain comes, if the ground does become very testing, we have to be flexible and adaptable and say, right, hang on a minute, we've got to keep this safe, we've got to keep this fair for the horses. It might be that we take 3 or 4 fences out, it might be that we take a loop out, the track might look different. We always have to be mindful that it's still to the level that it's set at, and it's still a proper competition. But I can see there being more sort of dynamicism in that. And I mean, if you look at Poe last year with the 5-star, they ended up, I think they took out 11 fences. I would slightly question that, because that does then become a very different test that you're asking. But I think, we have to be flexible. I think that we have to promote a good picture. So I think designers will become increasingly mindful of the picture that jump and that question creates. So we're trying to move away from sort of ugly pictures. And whereas before, it's kind of cross country, and we have to keep the integrity of it being cross country. But whereas before it was kind of like, a horse could, really stretch, really scramble, peck on landing, and the crowd would cheer because, the rider had sat it and it was dramatic, and those days are gone. That's kind of, I was shocked after Kentucky, just how much there was a German guy, Calvin, who rode Phantom of the Opera, and he had he jumped, there were 2 Mim triple bars on a sort of 90-degree turn, either 3 or 4 strides. And his horse really sort of like bellied on landing and sort of went down on all fours, almost on its belly, sort of lay down for a momentarily, got up, and he sort of, checked everything was fine, and, gave the horse a pat and carried on, and the horse was fine. But he got absolutely vilified. I mean, vilified on social media. And, the officials got vilified. Why hadn't they pulled him up? Why hadn't the horse been checked by a vet? All of that, sort of, dare I say it, social license, and that sort of public perception, that is changing how the sport will look. And, of course, horse welfare is always paramount, and we always want that to remain at the very, that is the key priority. But I think as a designer, we will increasingly be looking to, mitigate bad pictures or awkward or uncomfortable jumps, because we want the sport to be presented in a positive light, and the horses, to be looking, like they're enjoying the sport, which we know that they wouldn't do if they didn't enjoy it. But it's protecting that. It's protecting the image of the sport.
Mm-hmm. If there's anyone out there that would like to get into your career, what advice would you have for them?
Don't do it. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Watch. I cannot emphasize, there is no substitute for watching horses gallop and jump cross country fences. The more you can watch, the better. Get out, get to events, watch a lot of horses at a lot of different levels, traveling at different speeds, different types of fences, how much further they land out of a brush, for example, all of that. You can't get enough experience. And we're lucky in this country because we can go and watch, at an event, we can watch 250, 300 horses a day. In other countries, they might only see 30 horses a day. So you can get that experience. Ask and shadow. A lot of designers, I've been very, very fortunate. Mark Phillips has been, hugely supportive of my career, and I've, over the years, oh, Mark, can I come and walk Burley with you? Can I come and do this? Can I come and do that? Yeah, sure. And that's how you learn. And I'm also lucky. My husband is a course designer and a technical delegate, so I've always been very lucky because I've been able to bounce things off him as well. But we are all, we want to encourage the next generation, so please do come and ask and shadow us, come and get experience. And yeah, we're always very, very supportive of those that want to get into it, because there aren't that many of us. So please do.
A question that I like to ask all my guests is, obviously you ride, your job is very much to do with horses. This podcast is called Beyond the Stable. What do you do when you're not spending time with horses and thinking about horses?
Oh no, that's probably the worst possible question for me, to be honest. To be honest, if it's not the horses, it's probably the dogs. So very closely linked. So spending time with the dogs, just being outside, I guess. And we are very lucky in this, in this sport, because we go to some beautiful places, and we are in the countryside, and just being outdoors and appreciating that. I like to be a bit not sad, no, I like to read. That's my kind of escapism, and I sometimes have to have a conversation with myself to get off my phone and doom scrolling through social media, which does none of us any favors. But I do pick up a good book and really, really enjoy that, just to kind of get away from it all. And I think that's quite healthy. I guess it's whatever helps you and makes you feel good. You need to do. I keep telling myself I need to do some yoga or some Pilates or something, because I'm getting older and I'm getting stiffer. So I get on the horse and I'm like, oh God, things don't happen like they used to. But I also mentally, I think that's really good. And the relaxation side of it, I do actually really enjoy yoga and just mentally zoning out. So I probably need to do more of that.
My final question for you is, if I could get any other guests on the podcast, whether it be a professional, an influencer, just anyone cool in the equestrian world, who would you suggest?
Well, off the back of badminton as well, and what we've just seen this weekend, I'd be saying Ros Cantor. She's just amazing. I just admire her system, is so solid, and her training of the horses and her education, it just is phenomenal. And Ros is so tiny. She doesn't have the strength of, she doesn't have the strength of a guy for a start. But what she gets her horses to do, and what they do and want to do for her, is just incredible. And I think balancing that with, being a mum and everything else, I think Ros would be a really, really fascinating person to talk to.
Yeah, that's a fantastic suggestion. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I've really enjoyed it, and I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone watching has as well.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you guys for watching. If you're over on YouTube, make sure you're liking and subscribing. If you're on Spotify, make sure you're giving me a follow, leaving a review. This episode's been amazing. And like I said at the beginning, I'll leave information to tickets if you want to come and attend Bicton International Horse Trials down below.